How and when did the Buddhist tradition arise, and who was the Buddha? In this lecture, I'll be discussing origins of the Buddhist tradition, closely related to the life of the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. And we're going to start with some of the pre-Buddhist context for the arising of this tradition some 2,500 years ago. We begin with a very ancient civilization that existed in the subcontinent, probably going back before 2,500, before the Common Era. So a very ancient civilization indeed that goes under the broad label of the Indus Valley civilization or the Harappan civilization. The civilization was an agglomeration of city-states that grew up around the shores of the Indus Valley and the Indus River. And it was a fairly advanced civilization for its time, apparently engaging in extensive trade throughout Asia and Africa even. And it had a fairly organized political structure as far as we can tell. It was generally prosperous, really kind of building on the products of the Indus River. And we also take note from an archaeological standpoint of several artifacts that suggest that the religion of these people was a kind of nature polytheism that emphasized both the strength and power of the divine masculine as well as the kind of nurturing force, right, of the divine feminine. And we have evidence of certain kinds of rituals, purification rituals, a fully blown religious world, political worldview, seemingly that existed in this civilization. And here you see the contemporary geopolitical boundaries and the ancient city-states. Mohenjo-daro, probably the most famous, or Harappa. But something happened in the middle of the second millennium or so, before the Common Era, around 1500. A group of people from the outside appeared in northern India, and these people were apparently, as far as we can tell, originated in Central Asia, and they migrated not only to northern India, right, as you can see here on the map. If I move myself, there's Mohenjo-daro in the Indus Valley civilization. Not only did they migrate in that direction, but as you can see here, they spread out in all directions. And this leads linguists has led linguists to develop a very strong theory, the Indo-European theory, namely the idea that there was a proto-language, Indo-European, that was spoken by these people, or a version of it was spoken by these people. And they brought this language to all of these places where they migrated. And Indo-European, as the name suggests, becomes the origin language of the languages that are spoken both in South Asia and in Europe. So these people were responsible for the very foundations of the many languages that we speak. They also had a name for themselves that we can see in Sanskrit, right, in the ancient scriptures that are associated with these people that we'll talk about in a minute. They called themselves Arya, which means bright or the best. So their name for themselves was simply the superior ones, right? And we know that this term has been co-opted in recent centuries by white supremacists and Nazism and things like that. It really is a kind of anachronism, right, to connect contemporary individuals or nationalities or races with this original people. That's really a distortion of the history, but that is indeed where that terminology comes from, the Aryan terminology. They simply referred to themselves as the best and the superior and the best and the brightest in some sense. So we focus in on their impact in South Asia. And once they settled into South Asia, the northern part of what is now India, running up to the Himalaya mountains. A fully developed worldview developed. The so-called Aryans brought with them and inspired what eventually we refer to as the Brahmanical worldview. Brahmanism is one broad label for the religion in pre-Buddhist India, which lays the groundwork for Buddhism. So that's why we're talking about it here. But also for what eventually we call or collect within the label Hinduism. So sometimes people will mistakenly say that Buddhism arises from Hinduism. It's more accurate to say that both Hinduism and Buddhism arose from the Brahmanical worldview, from Brahmanism. Um, what we get started with in this worldview is a nature polytheism, right? Where individual gods or goddesses are associated with features of nature, like Ushas, the dawn, or Vayu, the wind, or Surya, the sun. But there are also figures that are a little bit more specific to this group, namely Indra, who is a kind of warrior god and kind of the patron god of the Aryan people. Generally speaking, these people were nomadic, whereas the Indus Valley people were settled agriculturalists. The Aryans were nomadic. They spread far and wide, as the map before indicated. They had chariots. They engaged in warfare and conquest. They brought their herds of cattle along with them to feed and supply their armies. So they were a distinct, very different kind of group compared to the lifestyle of the people that they found on the ground in the Indus Valley civilization. Um, the former hypothesis, right, about the demise of the Indus Valley civilization is that the Aryan people rolled in with their warlike ways, with their technology, the chariot, and basically eliminated and ethnically cleansed the people of the Indus Valley civilization. That's probably not accurate. There's some evidence that the Indus Valley civilization was already in decline by the time the Aryan people, Central Asian people showed up. Um, and so, and there was a combination of assimilation and mingling between these two cultures that happened over a period of time rather than one massive invasion and clash, right? So there are different theories about what happened and different speculations about what happened. But it is the case that the Indus Valley civilization seems to recede, and it is replaced by the features of the culture that the Aryans brought with them. So one of those features is indeed these worship of these nature goddesses and gods, and this patron god Indra. And these gods were tended to by very extensive rituals performed by the priests, especially the fire ritual, a ritual that goes back in Asia, Central Asia, for thousands of years, and it is still performed in India and in Hindu temples to this day. These gods were tended to by these priests, and the ritual formulae that they used and the hymns that they used started to come together in Sanskrit and Proto-Sanskrit, and they eventually evolve into the scripture that is revered within the Hindu tradition, namely the Vedas, right? So those texts were originally oral texts that were memorized by the priests and used in their rituals. And the priests, part of their authority, of course, is they actually were the ones who had this very crucial religious knowledge. The rituals were designed to gather the favor of these gods. So if we want a good harvest, if we want victory in warfare, if the king wants offspring, all kinds of human aims, right, could be attached to these gods and hopefully accomplished by properly performing extensive rituals, right, to get the gods' attention, give them offerings, and hopefully gain their favor. Um, as I mentioned before, these texts, as it were in a language that the Aryans brought with them, which was evolution from the Indo-European that I mentioned before, namely Sanskrit. Sanskrit is a holy language within Hinduism, but it's also a crucial language for Buddhism, and many Buddhist scriptures are written in Sanskrit and related languages. We have some perhaps more developed philosophical speculations that appear in the Vedas, in the Vedic collection. Um, Hymns to gods and also to creation. The idea of creation being the product of a primal human sacrifice. The cosmic man, Purusha, is chopped up into different pieces by the gods, and the different pieces of that primal man becomes parts of the universe and also part and parcel of the human social structure. Um, there's more open-ended kind of speculation, philosophical speculation that appears in the Vedic collection in its later phases, especially as it transforms into a body of text called the Upanishads, which we'll talk about in a moment. The Purusha or cosmic man sacrifice story leads to a mythic grounding of something that is very important within the Brahmanical worldview that was inherited by the Brahmanical people, right, in northern India from the Aryans, namely the idea of a fixed hierarchical social structure, or what's broadly referred to in English by caste. It's in the original language, these different classes are referred to as varnas or colors, right? Different stripes. And this system is a fixed hierarchy. It's a hereditary hierarchical system. And traditionally, there are four different uh, varnas within this system. Namely, and at the top, unsurprisingly, given what I've been saying before, the priests are at the top, the Brahmins are at the top of this system because they have the highest status within society. They're the ones who have the knowledge, right, that enables this community to get in touch with the gods and hopefully gain the favor of the gods. Next are the warriors or the kshatriya, and in fact, Siddhartha Gautama was born into this caste, right, within this system. Next come the merchants or the craftsmen, the Vaishya. And then at the bottom, there's the rest, the servants of the other castes, namely the Shudra. And again, this is a hereditary system. So if you're born into a certain caste, there's no idea you can get educated. And if you're a Shudra, get educated and become a merchant or join that class or become a priest. This is a fixed identity. And the idea eventually develops that this fixed, stable social order was a crucial element in maintaining order in the cosmos in general, or what's referred to in the Hindu tradition as dharma. So doing your dharma meant very significantly attaching yourself to your caste identity and performing the duties that pertain to that particular class. This is important as context, not only because it tells us in some sense where the historical Buddha came from in terms of his identity, but also because this was something that the historical Buddha eventually rejected, right? So this is part and parcel of this society into which he is born. It's ingrained within it in certain ways. So for him to reject this system outright was a pretty radical move. We see other kinds of movements emerging, right? Especially as we head into the first millennium before the Common Era, so at 900, 800, 700, somewhere in that region, leading up to the time of the historical Buddha. There's a kind of movement away from the kind of outward display of religiosity and social identity that dominated within this community, a move towards renunciation or stepping away from society, the renouncer tradition, as it's sometimes referred to. Um, we get the sense that some members of Vedic society or Brahmanical society were getting somewhat impatient with the authority of the priests and with these rigid social structures, and decided to search for deeper answers, right? They were all very much steeped in this culture, and they knew the scriptures, and they knew, um, they were part of the society, right? But they decided that they wanted to pursue deeper answers. So they stepped away from society and chose a life of asceticism, which entails intense self-discipline. It entails stepping away from social roles, and usually in this context, focused on inward turning meditation practices and yogic practices, where the search for the truth became an inward search and the product of this kind of self-discipline and self-mastery. Um, and so groups of these individuals started to retire from society and leave it behind and follow this renouncer movement. And they started to come up with some pretty interesting results, right? Some pretty interesting answers to their deeper questions about the nature of themselves, the nature of the gods, the nature of ultimate reality, and answers to questions about fundamental human questions about why we suffer, why we die, what happens to us after we die. They were after answers to these very big questions, and they came up with answers, or they discovered answers through the process of their asceticism and meditative techniques. Crucial ideas with which I'm sure that you are familiar, namely samsara, or that's the Sanskrit word for the cycle of birth and death that we all undergo. The idea that this is not a one-time thing, this lifetime. It is we go from lifetime to lifetime and are reborn and die again, and it's a constant cycle. This cycle is referred to as samsara. It is driven by something called karma. Karma literally means action in Sanskrit. And so the actions that we put out there, produce in the world, come back to us, right, in a fundamental way. Meritorious actions will produce good results in future lifetimes, and obviously evil behavior is going to produce negative results. Karma is a common concept, right? In Euro-American culture at this point. Um, but we usually think about it in fairly abbreviated terms, right? If somebody does something nasty and then they slip on a banana peel or something the next day, we say, well, karma got them. Well, in this worldview, karma is much stretches out much longer. It's part of the wiring of the universe, and the karma that we're experiencing now could be karma that we generated in a past lifetime or many, many lifetimes ago. The workings of karma are, for most of us, right, for most sentient beings, kind of mysterious. But we know that we get the general idea that if we do good things, it'll produce good results, and if we do negative things, it'll produce bad results in future lifetimes. They also discovered these renouncers, these meditators, these sages off in the forest, the idea of Atman and Brahman. Um, and this is really crucial for understanding the context of Buddhist philosophy that we'll be talking about over the next few weeks. Um, Atman is usually translated self, and Brahman is variously translated. It can sometimes referred to as ultimate reality, or the divine substance or something along those lines. It's hard to translate exactly. They're two sides of the same coin. The idea is that the Atman, the self that resides within us, is eternal and unchanging. It is a pervasive essence that resides within all of us. And here's the thing, it's not the same as your ego, and it's not the same as your personality. So it's not like an individual self like that. It is your true essence. And here's the trick, we all share the same true essence, divine essence that resides within us. So the flip side of that coin is the idea of Brahman, the idea that there is a pervasive, eternal reality that is behind all things, right? And resides within all things and resides within us under the label of the Atman. And the idea that these figures wanted to pursue was liberation from this world of change and illusion and immersion in this absolute abiding self or ultimate reality. That's why they ultimately were doing what they were doing. This would result, according to them, in moksha or liberation, liberation from the cycle, the very cycle that they identified with when they talked about samsara and karma. So the goal here was to ultimately to attain moksha or liberation from the cycle. Most people were not ready to drop everything and head off into the forest and follow the renouncer movement. So their midterm goal was to follow their caste duty, generate good karma, and hopefully achieve a better lifetime the next time around. But if you're ready to renounce and step away from everything that you know and go off into the forest, engage in intense asceticism and introspection, then maybe you are on the pathway towards liberation from the cycle of rebirth altogether. So this structure is important because it does in many ways lay the groundwork for the pattern in Buddhism. And there is a similar pattern in Buddhism, as we'll discover, namely that we are part of samsara. Buddhism fully accepts the samsaric worldview that we're born and reborn in lifetime after lifetime. And it also accepts the idea of karma, right? So that structure is also present in Buddhism. And so is the idea that the ultimate goal is some kind of liberation from that cycle. And in Buddhist circles, we're going to refer to that as nirvana. So there's some sharing going on here, and as we will discover, the Buddha decided to follow this renouncer path himself and joined this group of people who were making these discoveries out in the forest. But the Buddha is going to have a different insight. He's going to go in a different direction. He's going to disagree with some of these fundamental principles that are articulated in the Upanishads and take Buddhism in a different direction. These ideas are discussed, the insights and the discussions about these insights that these figures, these renouncers had, were recorded, and then they were cataloged in a further body of text that's attached to the Upanishad or to the Vedas called the Upanishads. So that in brief is the context, religious and cultural, for the appearance of the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. Before talking about the Buddha himself, it's important to remind ourselves that what we're talking about here is a myth. And often in common parlance, the word myth just simply means something that is erroneous or false or made up or something along those lines. Religious scholars have a somewhat more nuanced way of looking at the idea of myth. These are stories that have an authority to them. Their authority is accepted, and they set up patterns of understanding and action for the people who adhere to these myths. So the question is not really from the religious studies perspective, ask whether they are really true or not, though of course, historical interest is important, and historical data is important, and finding out things, whatever we can, from an empirical standpoint about figures like the Buddha or Jesus or Muhammad, for that matter, all of that is really important. But when we look at the way that practitioners engage these stories and the way they draw upon these stories, the way they retell these stories, we don't necessarily really need to drill down into whether they're true or not. We just want to understand their significance and how they provide a guidance for certain kinds of beliefs and for certain kinds of behavior. And the Buddha story definitely has that significance all across the Buddhist world. The elements of the story are drawn upon all the time, right, as precedents for people's actions, for rituals, etc. Um, so, what are the contours of this particular myth? Well, if we're going to talk about the samsaric worldview, and if the Buddha accepted that and the Buddha was part of that, then of course the Buddha's lifetime, right, where he founded, quote unquote, founded the Buddhist tradition was preceded by many lifetimes before that. And the early Buddhist tradition really takes advantage of this idea and starts to develop or collect stories of many of the Buddha's previous lifetimes in a collection of scriptures called the Jataka tales. And these are just three examples. There are hundreds of these tales taught in Buddhist schools across the Buddhist world. This is the way some of them are like Aesop's fables, kind of the way that kids learn about Buddhist teachings, right? Because the Buddha is always the hero in the story, but because it's the Buddha's previous lifetimes, he takes a whole bunch of different forms, and a lot of them he's animals, right? And so he's always a very special animal, right? Who does something really awesome in the story, but he took previous forms as animals, just like all of us have, right? According to the samsaric worldview. So just three examples quickly. The story of the cat vow, and why is there a rat if the story is the story of the cat vow? Well, the actual story, right, features the Buddha to be as the king of the rats, and he gets his crew together and defeats an evil jackal who's associated with a sneaky vow, right? That's about fooling people, basically, religiously, and that vow is referred to as the cat vow, right? So story of rats and a jackal, but goes under the label of the cat vow. We have the story of the swift goose. The Buddha is the swift goose, and the swift goose, in terms of his speed, is emblematic of impermanence, which is a crucial Buddhist theme. And the Buddha likens his incredible speed to the speed with which things transform and change, right? And develop and degenerate and all of those crucial Buddhist teachings. And then in a really interesting Jataka tale, we have the Buddha as a woman named Rupyavati, who makes an ultimate sacrifice on behalf of a uh, starving mother and her child, and then goes through a whole series of fascinating gender transformations in that particular story. But it is notable that the Buddha in this story takes the shape, takes the form, and this is a very patriarchal society that he's entering and part of, that he is acknowledged to have taken the form of a woman. So, upshot, the beginning of the Buddha's story is not his birth, right? The beginning of the story, the backstory, is very extensive indeed for a figure within the samsaric worldview. So now, if we move to a more conventional biography, the Buddha is born to a tribe called the Shakyas. One is now probably in Nepal, and his action of his lifetime really kind of circulates around northern India. Um, his father is the chief of this tribe. He's sometimes referred to as a prince. That maybe elevates him a little bit too much, but he's definitely part of the Kshatriya class and part of the kind of the ruling family, right, of this particular group. So he's born into privilege, and he is expected as the king's heir to follow in his father's footsteps and be the political and military leader of this particular community. There are signs early on, however, that things might go in a different direction. A fortune teller is brought to predict his future, and that fortune teller is a little bit vague, but there is a suggestion that he may not be the political military leader, but may transform and conquer the world in a very different way, namely through religious teachings. Um, that kind of possibility for his son is not something his father really wants to happen. So his father, really cloisters Siddhartha Gautama, it's the proper name of the historical Buddha, and tries to prevent him from acknowledging the troubles of the world, the difficulties of the world, anything that might kind of disturb him and maybe take him off of his ordained path to be the ruler and leader of the Shakyas. Anything that might shock his system and send him off seeking deeper answers. In other words, his father does not want him to go along with the renouncer movement. So he surrounds Siddhartha with beautiful people and young people, and keeps him within the confines of the palace and won't let him go out and experience the world. His whole world is just simply in the palace. He's brought up in the traditions of Brahmanical Vedic society as an upper caste individual would. He learns the scriptures, he learns the things that are proper to his caste. He is eventually married and goes into the householder phase of life and has a child. And so everything seems to be going the way it's supposed to go for Siddhartha Gautama, at least according to his father's version of the story. There's something in Siddhartha that where he knows that something is off and something is wrong. Maybe it's traceable to the fact that his mother died very soon after childbirth and was indeed replaced by mother figures, right, in his upbringing. But maybe there's just an inkling that something is wrong. And we also have the sense that, if he's going to be a great world conqueror, he probably needs to know the world, right, at the very least. So he gets curious and takes several secret missions outside of the walls of the palace. And when he does so, kind of in disguise, right, discreetly, he encounters human suffering, and he has a legendary kind of encounter with a sick person, with an elderly person, with a dead person, and then he sees one of these renouncers, and he asks what they all are because he's never seen any of this, right? Is the dead person sleeping? What's wrong with the old person? What's wrong with the sick person? He's never encountered any of this before, and what is that renouncer person doing? And he is so shocked by all of this, shocked and stunned, that he decides that he needs to go out and find the answers for himself. He needs to find the answers to human suffering and degeneration, the answers to what we do about our suffering and our death. Is there a way to escape it? Is there a way to bring human beings some sort of answer and some sort of release and escape from these things that seem to be our ultimate destiny and fate? Takes a bit of privilege and bravado, right, for an individual to want to go and do that. And in addition, he leaves his wife and child and family behind and sneaks out at night. So he obviously thinks this is his mission in life and takes it with every degree of seriousness and self-sacrifice. After this, he joins in with the renouncers, and part of their practice, as I mentioned before, is intense self-discipline. So this means refraining from all sensual pleasures, obviously sexuality, um, also, in terms of eating and consumption, they try to minimize that as much as possible to minimize the contact, right, with the changing material, illusory world around us, right? The world of the senses for these figures is the enemy. And so he engages in intense discipline, learns the meditative techniques of these renouncers, and becomes very advanced very quickly in his small community of forest dwellers. Um, After about 6 years of this, he's on the verge of starving himself to death. And so he has a further realization that this is not working. You're not going to solve the problem of suffering by making yourself suffer. And so he makes a decision to leave his community, much to the chagrin of his compadres out there. And he leaves them behind and wants to chart out his own way. He strengthens himself again, right? He strengthens his body and gets himself kind of back in shape, as it were. And then, only then, after going to the ultimate extreme of indulgence, right, in his younger life, and then going to the ultimate extreme of self-denial, right, in his previous experience with the renouncers, he decides to follow the middle way, right, a kind of balance down the middle. And that's when he decides to sit down under a tree and meditate and discover the answer. And according to the tradition, after some severe trials and tribulations and temptations, he eventually does, in fact, find the answer. And the answer is the origin of Buddhist teaching. He is convinced to turn around and share his enlightenment with the rest of the world. It wasn't quite clear he was going to do that at the beginning, according to some versions of the story, but he does. And he encounters some of his old colleagues, his old friends, in an Indian holy city called Varanasi, and he gives them his first sermon, right? Starts to convey what he learned there under the tree. And according to the tradition, they are instantly enlightened and instantly achieve nirvana from hearing this teaching. He teaches his experience and organizes a tradition. It's a founder tradition where the founder actually has a pretty significant hand in actually setting up the institutions and structures of the later tradition. For example, he separates out monks and the lay people, right? From the very get-go, we have that distinction in the Buddhist tradition. And eventually he's persuaded to ordain nuns as well. And we'll talk about gender down the road. But he sets up these structures, he sets up rules for the monastic community, rules for the non-monastic, the regular everyday people. He teaches for like 4 decades, right? And then finally, he dies and achieves what's called parinirvana, which is ultimate nirvana. He has completely departed the realm of samsara. Now, where he goes, well, that's a matter of some speculation, and there are different versions of that in the Buddhist Buddhist world, which we will be investigating. Here you see a lovely limestone statue of the Buddha, the historical Buddha from Sri Lanka, and it's in that limestone just carved directly into the rock. And so the kind of marbling of the rock is reflected in his body, a really kind of cool emblem of both stability and peace, and also transformation and change with kind of those waves of rock and layers of rock that appear within his body itself. So, how should we analyze this story? Well, there are many, obviously, many different ways of analyzing this story and the significance of this story. One way in the academic study of religion, or one pathway within the academic study of religion, is really to emphasize individual experience, right? To place our emphasis in terms of like, where does the essence of religion reside? If we want to understand religion at its deepest level, where should we look? And there's a strong impulse in religious studies or the history of theories within religious studies on individual experience. The answer to those questions is to look at individual experience. And there's perhaps no more famous kind of representative of that school within the academic study of religion than William James, the early 20th century psychologist and philosopher, and famous Bostonian and Harvard professor. Um, Here are a couple of quotations from the Beginner's Guide to the Study of Religion from William James. So long as we deal with the cosmic and the general, we deal only with the symbols of reality. But as soon as we deal with private and personal phenomena as such, we deal with realities in the completest sense of the term. So we're not looking at the big picture things, the big beliefs, the institutions, the kind of trappings of religion, even the scriptures. We should be looking, according to James, at the private and personal element of religion. And then we're really dealing with religious reality. He further says that the emphasis should be on the inner experiences of great-souled persons wrestling with the crises of their fate. And that idea does seem to apply pretty well to the story of the Buddha as a founder figure. He goes through these transformations and changes, wrestling with his own fate, right, with his own mortality, with the suffering of us as human beings and his own suffering and what we should do about it. And so he makes major changes and transformations in his life, and ultimately finds the answer that sets the rest of his life in motion as a religious founder and teacher. So if we pay attention to those moments within the Buddha's story, then we really get at religious reality in the completest sense of the term, to use James' phrase. So we really want to emphasize individual experience, and in particular, James trained our attention on mystical experience. Experience as the core, in many instances, as the core of kind of religious reality. Um, Experience that turns life stories around. James reports a lot of stories of people who kind of hit rock bottom, and then that's where they find religious or spiritual ideas, and it allows them to turn their life around. He quotes the biblical phrase, "You shall know them by their fruits," right? So, if something works for somebody and gets them out of that horrible pit of despair, right, then it's something that we should pay attention to, according to James. These experiences also break down the boundaries of the self, and the world, and give us a kind of expansive feeling of connection with realities outside of ourselves, right? Um, and given one of the insights that the Buddha comes up with under that tree, namely the idea that there is no self, that would seem to apply to his particular instance. James also identifies several key characteristics of mystical experiences that make them powerful and what they are. Experience that is ineffable, that is, it's very difficult to put in words. Ultimately, nirvana seems to fit with that idea. Noetic quality, which means you know something as a result, you just know it. And the Buddha seemed to have accomplished something like that. Experiences that are transient, that is, they come and go. And the Buddha did indeed have a period of time where he was having this experience of enlightenment, and then he came back, right? Also, the idea of passivity, it's something that happens to you, right? It comes to you. And while the Buddha worked really hard, right, to achieve these insights, one could say that the answers came to him, right? They ultimately came to his doorstep. He had to be receptive in a whole variety of ways, but they appeared to him in that way. These categories are helpful in terms of description, and that's one of the things that theories do. They give us vocabulary for describing things. And you can use this terminology from James to describe the variety of states that the Buddha experienced, and also those sought out by the Buddha's followers who are trying to follow in his footsteps. Theories help us with the description, and James is very helpful with description, but they also lead to definitions. And this is James's definition of religion. We can think about whether it in fact applies to Buddhism or some forms of Buddhism. Religion, therefore, as I now ask you to arbitrarily take it, shall mean for us the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men and women and their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. Um, an individual having feelings, acts, and experiences in solitude is matches with the Buddha's experience, and everything seems to build around that individual experience. And that's important for James and his theory that everything kind of originates and keeps and is maintained in a religious tradition because of individual deep experiences. Um, these experiences are in response in relation to whatever individuals consider to be divine. And this may be a bit of a stretch, but probably that kind of terminology would apply to the Buddhist pursuit of nirvana. So I hope that's a hopeful overview of the context, pre-Buddhist context for this tradition, and also a helpful account of the Buddha's life with a little bit of help from William James.